Your Bibles, if you would, to Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18. And we've been working on this study of the book of Revelation. We talked a little bit over the last couple of weeks that as we kind of approach the end of the book, it gets harder. The symbols and the applications and the descriptions that you find, particularly from about chapter 20 on, in some ways, create challenges for us. And so we'll work through some of that as we study together, and we'll try to gain as quality and understanding of the principles that are being shared in the narrative of Revelation as we study through it. But tonight, as we get back into the study and we look here at chapter 18, really chapter 18 is fairly simple to understand in terms of its emphasis. He's going to talk, still talking about the judgment that God is bringing. He's still talking about the challenges that it's going to present. He's still talking about those who are going to have to absorb this judgment that's coming from God and the difficulties of it, and also some that will be spared from that along the path. If you recall, I believe in chapter 16 what we saw was a series of angels. Remember, there were 7 of them, and each of them had their own vial, if you will, a bowl of judgment in this figure that John was seeing, that they were each pouring out in relationship to the symbolism that was used as Babylon, that great Babylon, who we've pretty much concluded is that Roman Empire. And so this judgment that's been under discussion is that of the Roman Empire. God is judging that empire for their oppressive relationship towards Christians, the challenges they brought in creating difficulties for the spread of the gospel. And so here comes this judgment. And you've seen it in various ways. You've seen Rome described in various ways throughout the narrative. And in chapter 16, you saw those 7 angels demonstrating the various levels and difficulties of judgment that God was going to bring. Then in chapter 17, John has a conversation with one of them. We're not told which one, but we're just told that one of those 7 angels and John have a conversation. And they talk more extensively about the judgment that God was bringing and the certain kinds of things that they could be watching for in relationship to it. In chapter 18 now, notice at the very beginning of the chapter, and after these things, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And so, 7 angels, each do their job in terms of the narrative in chapter 16. And again, we're not talking about something that was happening in John's time. They're talking about things that would happen one after another over a span of time. But so you see those, you have the conversation in chapter 17, and now you just yet have another angel, and John have yet another conversation and see this vision of what's transpiring in and amongst this judgment that God is bringing. So he comes down, he's got great power, he's so much power that he seems to do what? To the earth. He light it up, okay? And remember, these are visions, okay? These aren't reality. This isn't specifically what's happening. This is how John is having depicted for him what has happened. And so to illustrate that the immense power that this angel has been given through the hands of Jehovah, he's got so much that he can light up the earth and glorify God in the process. And he cries out mightily, verse 2, with a strong voice saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. And so this angel is discussing what stage of the judgment of God against Rome. At the end of it, right? He's talking and discussing about things because he's using phrases, it is fallen, it is done. He's talking about the things that are viewed in many senses after that judgment takes place. after all that condemnation from God is poured out against that empire, He's now showing John a vision of what things are going to look like. And again, I think we'll be very easily able to see here in just a little while in this narrative that we're talking about a judgment against a particular entity, a particular leadership group, a particular nation, and a particular group because of the things that are happening after it. When it comes to final judgment, what's happening after that? Yeah, eternity, right? And eternity's after that, right? When the Bible speaks about final judgment, He talks about Jesus saying, I'm going to separate the sheep from the goats, and there's going to be a distinction, Jesus said. This judgment is poured out against a nation, referred to symbolically as Babylon, who we've concluded to be Rome within our study, based on several hints, if you will, and circumstantial evidences within the book. But there are going to be nations, kings of the earth, who gaze at this empire when it falls, who are still around. Final judgment wouldn't allow for that. Final judgment has much more finality to it than what we're going to see here. So again, I think we're seeing an isolated circumstance. So he says, when it's all looked at, he says it's become a habitation of, for demons or devils, it's a stronghold or a hold of every foul spirit and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Let me just share something with you. And I was reading some of these things, trying to figure out this imagery. What's John driving at here? Is he? And again, I don't know that we skip over to the literal all of a sudden. He's still seeing this in a vision. And so I don't think you jump straight over to the literal and say now amongst where the Roman Empire once was, there's a bunch of spirits flying around. But let me ask you this. Anybody been around where there's been an old abandoned house somewhere? And what are the tales that are told about old abandoned houses? They're haunted, right? They're haunted. By the way, that notion has been around forever. The idea of that which is laid desolate becoming the housing or dwelling place of spirits is a human concept that has been around for a long, long time, which I believe has now made its way into John's description of how Rome will be seen. It will be laid so desolate that when people see it, they'll think, I don't want to go there. Why? Place filled with ghosts. There's nothing but devils and spirits running around that place. That's how deeply desolate the place would become. And that seemed like a pretty plausible description of that to me. There could be other reasons why he uses this kind of narrative and these descriptions, but that seemed to play well, if you will, with the descriptions in relationship to the destruction that's coming, especially when you keep reading and see the utter devastation that happens at the end of this series of judgments. Other thoughts, ideas? I'll pause for a moment.
Most of the kings and stuff that coming to another country, they destroyed everything.
Yeah.
They took the people away. They destroyed the cities. Nothing left.
Yeah. If you did not intend to inhabit that area, then you would leave it desolate so that it could not be inhabited by others and that they could not rebuild. And so depending on your purpose, there were times where some nations would come in and their full intention was to let the people continue to reside there and make them servants of yours. Other times they come in and and that's the description here. He's going to lay it to waste. And that's what we'll see further through this chapter. So he says, and for all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Remember that very explicit kind of description of her in chapter 17, and the idea of harlotry and fornication and covenant breaking in those descriptions. And so the challenge is that other nations have bought into what Rome had led them to, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. Not a real person, talking about how they have allowed that empire to pull them into their sinful practices and purposes and intents. And the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. What I want you and I to appreciate, especially out of chapter 18, and we'll see it more before it's over, is the lifestyle the Roman Empire was living when it began to crumble. They were living a lifestyle that was lavish and extravagant. And these merchants were doing what? Making lots of money because the Roman Empire as a whole was living it up. And the lifestyle was tremendous. There's a later description in this chapter about scarlet and purple and fine linen and gold as a description of the whole, not just necessarily the particular leader in charge, but the way the lifestyle was. And let me ask you just from if we want to illustrate it from a physical sense, would you rather fall from 1 foot or 20 feet? Right? If I got to fall, I'd rather fall from 1 foot than I would from 20 feet. Because that's going to be more painful, right? The much further distance you fall, the more painful it becomes. That's also emotionally, spiritually, in any other kind of description you want. Rome's fall is tremendous. They are just at the peak of just having anything and everything their hearts desire, and then crash. And here in a little while, you're going to see people standing off to the side looking at this sight of this empire that once lived so lavishly that's now crumbled before them, and just be amazed at what they're seeing. And so everybody bought in because everybody was getting rich. Rome got richer. Those who were selling them goods got richer. Those who were exchanging in marketplace everybody was doing great through the abundance of her delicacies. And then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." When these judgments, often within the book of Revelation referred to as plagues, often used illustrations referring even back to the days of Moses in relationship to that description, throughout the whole book, the challenge has been for God's people to not get caught up in it all. It would have been really easy. It is real easy, isn't it? To get caught up in the good life. It's easy to get caught up in the abundance of blessings that are even around us on many of occasions. And so God talks to His people, His children, the believers within this description and says, listen, everybody around Rome is just flocking. And they're all just coming and they're all becoming partakers of everything she's offering to them. Don't succumb to those temptations. Because if you do, when the plagues come, what happens? When the judgment comes, I'm going to receive it too. Okay, the only way to be immune, for lack of a better description, the only way to survive the judgment of God is to distance yourself from the sins of the empire. That's the only option that's ever given really throughout the book of Revelation. If you want any hope, if you want any ability to survive all this, then maintain your relationship with God. Because the temptation is, and we alluded to this a little bit on Sunday morning, that you're talking about late 90s that this was written. The empire meets its ultimate demise in around what? Yeah, about 470 some, right? And so there's still a lot of time that has to go by. Remember, even the last chapter when we studied it said there'd be kings and there'd be another king and another king and another king and another king, right? Kings that don't even know they're going to be kings. yet to come. And so there's conversation within Revelation that tells us this is a long, drawn-out process. In some ways, it's going to have to take place. Not forever, but it's not going to all happen one right after the other. One day, one, the next day, the next day, the next day. And so the temptation would be that the judgment hasn't come yet. I haven't seen any harm. Things are going great. Anything we make, we're able to sell. Anything we want to buy is available to us. And he warns them.
Do we say the same thing about us?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the same levels of temptations are present for us as well. And I think, Jim, that if we're not honest about that, then we'll probably fail in recognizing the dangers that riches can bring. We have to be honest, and I know sometimes what happens is we try to make that relevant to something, and we try to compare ourselves to some other standard. But there's still lots of places in the world who go to bed hungry, and probably not any of us. I don't want to speak on anybody's behalf.
People get caught up in the good life, they say, and they can't get out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Go ahead, Randy. Be separate. Yeah. 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 And it's tough because you've got to separate yourself from those sinful practices, and not necessarily be able to move to another country. If that makes you've got to find a way to fight and resist the temptations in the environment you're in. Yeah. 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 And I think, Randy, it's an easily proven truth that the longer we allow ourselves to be connected to sinful practices, the less sensitive to it we will become. And that's just, we could anecdotally prove that over and over and over again. Yeah, and it happens on a regular basis. Yeah, and that's kind of part of the process. Anytime culturally somebody wants to change something, what the process is to just is to first not just convince everybody of a complete change. The process is to desensitize people to the issue. Once you desensitize them to the issue, now you can make the changes that you want. And that's kind of the way culture works. And that's the way the Roman culture was working. That's the lesson for us, and that's what was happening to them, and they needed to get out of that and not succumb to that culture and the sinful practices. How far-reaching were her sinful practices in the sense of knowledge of it? Verse 5. Yeah. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. I think especially if this angel was talking about the end of this process, not somewhere in the middle or the beginning of it, and so a lot of years have come and gone between the initial writing of the letter to the initial challenges that Rome began to experience, the up and down experiences that they encountered. Remember earlier in the discussions about how it was wounded. Nobody thought it would survive the wound. It comes back to life. And so within the book, there's a description of how time kind of comes and goes, and they experience highs and lows for a while. But God says, in a description of the end of these things, He says, I haven't forgotten any of it. There may have been some time passed by. I haven't forgotten any of it. Now, their iniquities, I remember it. God has made a record, if you will, of those things. So he says, verse 6, and this might cause us a little angst for a moment to try to sort through this. He says, reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double, according to her works, in the cup which she hath filled, fill to her double. Who's he talking to? Who is it that's supposed to reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double according to her works in the cup which she hath filled, fill to her double? Who is that? And there was a question, if you went through the questions, that addressed that, if you recall going through the questions for chapter 18. And I'll give you the quick answer. And I get to give the easy answer tonight. And you guys get to give the hard answers. My answer would be initially, we don't know. Because he doesn't say. Right? There's nothing that I can see enough, and again, I'm not an English major, and so I don't profess to be able to understand all the way language works. But I was not able to look at this context and immediately decide from in front of it or behind it or from any other direction exactly who's under conversation here. The only two entities that we've seen is an angel and who? And John, right? So you got angel and John, and you got God in the mix of these things. And so again, and here's why I make this statement, because you may have ran into the question. And the writer of the questions pointed you to Romans chapter what? Romans chapter 12. And because Romans chapter 12 tells us what about vengeance and seeking personal retribution? Yeah. That it's not to be personal, right? That retribution and vengeance and retaliation is not to be personal. And that God has established what to handle those things? Laws and governments and systems, right? We're not to be out seeking personal retribution because God has set governments and situations in place to handle those circumstances. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think, Randy, and that's the point, is don't be careful that we don't take verse 6 away from other things that we understand about the way God has worked. He is not like, I don't believe it all, and it's the book of Revelation. I could be as mistaken as a billion other scholars who've written on, well, I just put myself in a group of scholars. Never mind, scratch that phrase. But you understand what I mean? I can be wrong on this, but if I understand those other narratives like Romans chapter 12, then Christians have never been given license to seek their own retribution. So I can't imagine that all of a sudden, because of the magnitude of the situation, God says, okay, it's different for this. You guys go get them double. Whatever they did to you, you go get them double. It doesn't fit. It doesn't seem to fit the character of God that we've seen. But Randy's right. Who's actually going to be coming in bringing these judgments? Kings and nations and peoples from other places. As the empire weakens, they become vulnerable, and God, as He has done throughout history, will use other nations and empires and rulers to bring the challenges that He needs or the judgment that He needs. And when He sends them in, He's saying, I'm going to send them bringing double what you have done to others. That's what I see in that. Not all of the personal kind of side of it that might seem to be there. But as this angel is declaring what's going to be happening, and remember verse 7 was in reference to the fact that their sins had reached to God, and within that breath, He says, reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double according to her works, and the cup which she hath filled, fill to her double. When this judgment comes, it is going to be severe. And anything they imagined or could have done to others, it will be doubly challenging for them when that judgment comes. Yep. Yeah.
Burned him in a garden pit of tar, how he drove around in there. We find him cast to lions. We find him torn about by other wild animals. And the continuous thrown in dungeons. He had it all, everything you think of. Yeah. So no wonder the Lord's wrath was upon him.
Yeah. And when it gets poured out, it will be devastating. It will be devastating.
Brian?
Yep, go ahead.
I was referenced in the Bible, Jeremiah 50. Verse 14 and 15. It says, "Put yourselves in array against Babylon round about, all ye that bend the bow. Shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. Shout against her round about, she hath given her hand, her foundations are fallen, her walls are thrown down. For it is the vengeance of the Lord to take vengeance upon her, as she hath done unto me."
Yeah. And so when God's judgments are poured out, it's very similar language that you see here in terms of the devastation that God can wrought.
Also in Revelation 17, verse 16, it mentions the 10 horns, of course, which were the 10 days.
Yeah.
And it says, "Which thou sawest before the beast, these shall hate before and shall make her desolate.
Yeah.
And naked and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire."
Yeah.
And it's talking about the nation.
Yeah, the nation. So when you combine the two conversations, you get a clearer image of what the descriptions are. And then you tie in those Old Testament references that show us similar kinds of languages. We begin to build a picture and an understanding of the total the devastation that God is going to bring. And notice, as all this is being poured out, how much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously. So much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. I thought about that a lot, and I think that even there's a question in the worksheets that ask about the three things out of this text that she described herself as, and it's interesting though. She says, and maybe I sit a queen and am no widow might be more of a singular statement. Because think about it. In other words, she is ruler over, and she didn't marry the king, and the king died, and I inherited my rule. I am the rule. I am the queen. Not by becoming a widow. Nobody died to empower me. No, nobody. I just what I am. And I think they probably do that because throughout the narrative, how is the empire as a whole been being described? Masculine or feminine? Feminine a lot, right? Especially here, it's her, her, her. And so because of that feminine distinction, when you refer to her now, she gets referred to as a queen, but maybe then the qualifier is, but not a queen whose husband happened to die. She believes herself to be fully, empowered on her own, and I will see no what? And I will see no sorrow.
She said, "I'm too powerful.
Yeah.
It can't happen to me."
Yeah. And again, I don't, because we're talking about that she, her, that so now you're not talking about just a leader or a ruler or two, you're talking about the nation. The nation is convinced they have too much wealth, too much power, too much influence. They are incapable of any kind of collapse. There will not be any sorrow come to us. And any nation who begins to convince itself, I don't care if it's Rome, I don't care if it was the Greeks before them, or the Babylonians, or the Medo-Persians, or the US of A. Any nation that convinces itself that is too powerful and too strong and too wonderful and has too many riches and too many blessings that it cannot fall. Has never read a history book, and you could learn that without ever picking up a Bible. Not that you should do that, but I'm saying you could know and understand that basic concept without ever having to read about a historical document from Scripture. You could get that from secular history on its own, would fully illustrate what the Bible is clearly teaching about nations who convince themselves that they can't fall. And it's a danger that we have to accept the realities of.
You're gonna find out that you're not stopping.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian. I'll come back. No, you're good. No, you're good, Brian.
That took me to Zephaniah 2:15. This is the rejoicing city that dwelt carelessly, that said in her heart, I am, and there is none beside me. How has she become a desolation, a place for beasts to lie down? Everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his teeth.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, and I'm trying to think about Zephaniah and other of the prophets, particularly even the ones that deal with Judah and Israel. To me, that speaks volumes about what God will and can and has done. If God is willing to bring devastation and judgment against His own people, then why would I even have a hesitation to think that He would measure judgment against any people? Because even His own chosen people are not excused in their relationship with Him. And so the warnings are sobering. And when you read those Old Testament passages and connect them, it's even more powerful. Go ahead, I thought I heard it. Yeah. It is. Yeah. And there's a ton of books and materials that you could read, and you think you're looking in a mirror. You absolutely think you're looking in a mirror. And the old saying, those who don't remember history are destined to repeat it. And this is still a great country, and with still lots of potential left for good things. But the minute it thinks it's bigger and better than God, we'll learn like others have.
We want to make sure we make a distinction that there's no certain group set apart. God will only judge that group. God is God over all mankind. He created man. He exercises judgment over his creation. And but he has set apart a group of people who are Christians, who follow Christ. And that's a distinction for sure. The judgment is on them as well as the rest of the world.
Yeah. And Randy, since we're heading that path for a minute, so because we're talking application a little bit here. So what do you do? What do you do? And the temptation in the midst of what we might look into our world even right now, and I probably, depending on how old folks are sitting in front of me, if I were to ask certain ones, I would probably get a little bit different. But there's probably some folks here that think that we have digressed in ways that you would never imagine we would digress as a nation over the past 50 years. And the temptation is to do this, right? The temptation is to throw up your hands and go. But remember, Jesus said, "You are the light of the world, a city that is set upon a hill. You are the salt of the earth." I am convinced, and have always been convinced, by the way, that what will save, maintain, sustain any nation in many ways is enough people being light and salt. And that's what I have to be. I can't, though I may be frustrated, I can't throw my hands up in disgust and say, well, let her fall. That might be that might be the easiest way, but Jesus challenges those folks, us, to be light and salt, and hope that has an empowering effect upon people.
When you look at the rise in pollination through thousands of years, and you look at the United States and everything, Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah. People just keep doing the same things over and over again. Yeah, I've always said that human nature and the thought processes of men have not changed at all. Human behavior is probably a better way to describe that. Has not changed at all. Technology changes. We fight wars differently, but we're still fighting wars. We find ways to harm one another, and may not do it with arsenic anymore. But you know what I mean. But the point is that human failure, failure of behavior, has been around, and people just keep doing the same things and causing the same problems and the same difficulties. It's unfortunate.
Over the years, like we were talking about, social media, you hear more of it in different parts of the world, so
Yeah.
it's worse than it was back in so days.
Yeah. And I believe, Marlene, there is some to that. I believe that our ability to know things instantaneously has made us in some ways react differently. History used to have to history kind of had to be, it had to be experienced. Whatever the situation was, it had to be experienced, and then it had to be documented, and then it had to be shared. And so you had a span of time, and you would learn about them, but not in real time. But our modern world, we learn about everything in real time. And so I think we are exposed in a lot of ways to a world that maybe at times isn't as vastly different than it's ever been. Just we have access to the knowledge, and you could illustrate that. I mean, you think even something as deeply as disturbing as the Holocaust was. It took American leaders a long time to convince themselves that was really going on over there. And you can go back and read the history surrounding that time period, and there were times where there were folks on a boat heading over, and the president said, no. And so there's mistakes can be made when it comes to those things in those days, because in those days information didn't work quite like it does today. In fact, now we've got so much information we don't even know what to believe anymore. And so we've kind of gone the other extreme. It used to be we didn't have enough information to make as good a judgments and decisions as would like to have made in those moments. Now we're in a circumstance we've got so much information we can't decipher what to rely on and what not to rely on. And anyway, I digress a million miles if I go any further, so I'll stop. Yeah, and that's a great segue back to where we need to be, Gary. And that's their situation. That's our situation. That is every situation. That ultimately God's the one in control and responsible for those things. Yep, go ahead. Yeah. And there could be all kinds of reasons why he uses these kinds of descriptions. Just like I tied I am a queen to I am no widow, I could also tie I am no widow to no sorrow. Because what would you associate with a widow? Mourning and sorrow, right? And so you could bounce it that direction as well. And so you get a general idea. of she doesn't think she ever is experiencing anything challenging or sorrowful. And because of that, therefore, there's the connection, verse 8, shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. Again, I'm talking about literal descriptions here. We're talking about John's vision. And so he says, therefore, because she thinks she stands and can't fall, because she thinks she will never experience any mourning or sorrow, it hits her how? Hard. It hits her hard, like it all, as if, not that it did. We've already illustrated how it's going to take a span of time for all these things to occur. But it will feel to her like it happened all in one moment. In one day, she'll feel the death, the mourning, the famine. It will hit her in a shocking way once the realization of what's happening hits with the nation. They won't see. Right. And we've already seen those thief pictures and illustrations already in the narrative of Revelation. So that's the way this comes to her. And though it takes a span of time, it's going to hit in a way that they'll feel like it just all of a sudden happened. Because they didn't mourn over their sins, because they never attempted to repent, because they blasphemed God every time He tried to steer them onto the right path. It will feel like it just hits all of a sudden. Yeah, absolutely. And their complacency is going to be ultimately their greatest demise that will lead them into this circumstance. Absolutely. For God is strong, who's bringing this judgment, and the kings of the earth, who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her, shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city, Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. So, to the nation itself, it feels like it all happens in a day, right? That's the way it feels. Even those kings and folks who are out on the outskirts, and they've been benefiting by the trade and the ability to provide goods and to buy goods and this reciprocal relationship and this buying into the whole Roman philosophy. They see it from a distance. And though they had benefited for a while from it, what are they doing? Trying to. They're trying to stay clear. Yeah, they're trying to steer clear of this. They see all that torment over there in Rome, and they're trying to figure out a way. That was our livelihood, but we don't dare go over there. And keep in mind, back to our earlier conversations, God's using nations, other empires, other peoples, who saw the vulnerabilities of Rome, God's purposes fulfilled, they come, and these folks who have kind of benefited for a long period, they stand off to the side, and they lament, and they bewail. Who are they really disappointed about? Themselves, right? They're not so much concerned about the fact that Rome itself fell. They're more concerned about the fact that because Rome fell, now I'm in trouble. I'm going to have difficulties because of that. The merchants, verse 11, of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore.
They're weeping because they're losing money.
Yeah. Yeah, one day you used to load a ship and send it towards Rome, and the next day there's no place to send it. 1 hour you were living great, and the next day you can't find a buyer for your products, and so I'll be careful not to be overly political, but and not even political, but maybe. Well, anyway, you call it whatever you want. But I don't necessarily believe in isolationism. But think about it. Rome had so much power and influence, and so many other economies. Okay, let's not forget, these were real nations, real situations, real people. Though the imagery is vision and symbolic language and all that kind of thing, but Rome was a real empire who had a real economy. There were tributaries to it that had real economy. So they were so intertwined with one another that when Rome fell, they all started falling. They all started falling. And again, I'm not trying to be political, I'm trying to be historical. That when empires get too powerful, and when too much of the economy is tied to one central place within a world environment, if that one place collapses, the rest hurt. That's what's happening. As Rome crumbles before their very eyes, they're also saying to themselves, uh-oh, now how am I going to survive? Because I tied myself so strongly to Rome. Now where am I going to turn? And if you wanted to do some research on it, and I'll stop after this, you might be surprised that I'm not so sure it's us that controls the economy of the world anymore. But anyway, for another time. Any other thoughts?
Rome itself was the center of commerce
Yeah.
for the entire world at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, the world
Yeah.
depended on it.
And that's what and that's the point I'm really trying to make sure we grasp here, Gary, without chasing too many modern rabbits. And basically God has said, I'm bringing this judgment, and if you tied yourself to them, I'm not protecting you. And He may not have to lift a finger towards any of these other nations, because the moment Rome falls, they fall right along with it. And He may not have to send an invading force, if you will, even into those places. Because the desolation that's going to come because of they're so deeply connected to Rome. And we could historically illustrate that over time.
They don't realize what they've done over the years affects how many people all the way around them.
Yeah.
It's not right in one spot, it's everywhere.
Yeah. So there's a lot of sadness going on. And particularly, folks, according to verse 12, who dealt in what? Yeah, the most expensive kinds of things. Gold's nice, but you can't eat it. Right? And silver's nice, but you can't eat it. And the moment that it doesn't have the value that it once did, then you better start growing some corn. Because, you can have a pocket full of silver, but if that's meaningless in terms of its value, then so that's what's happening. They had so become so dependent upon those issues of luxury, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet, particular types of wood, all manner of vessels of ivory and precious wood, brass and iron and marble. Sounds like a house Solomon would build, doesn't it? And those things are meaningless in the face of this desolation. It doesn't matter. All those things become of inconsequential issue. All right. Lord willing, we'll come back Sunday. We'll finish up chapter 18. We'll answer the questions for chapter 18. And we'll see if there's time to move to chapter 19 or not.